Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. February 23rd, 1943. Berlin. Imagine yourself standing amidst the cold silence of a city under siege, smoke snakes skyward from shattered factories, staining the winter sky like ink in water. Through the frost-bitten windows of Telefunken headquarters, the devastation is visible, and yet, inside, something far more unsettling grips one man's attention. Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Runge holds a magnifying glass in trembling fingers, peering at a small gleaming copper object no larger than a clenched fist. His breath catches. This should not exist. He scribbles hurriedly in a top-secret report. This cannot be real. Can you feel the weight of that realization? A seasoned German scientist, face to face with a piece of Allied engineering so compact and powerful, it might as well have come from another planet. No known nation could produce such raw output in such a small frame. Not Germany, not the Americans, not even the Soviets. But there it was, cold, silent, and very real. This fragment, salvaged from the charred remains of a British Stirling bomber that went down near Rotterdam on the night of February the 2nd, had shaken the very foundations of German confidence. Barely 10 centimeters in diameter, yet capable of generating microwave frequencies that left every German countermeasure as useless as a sword against thunder. They called it a cavita magnetron. It was brilliant in its elegance, catastrophic in its implications. A technological specter that haunted Runge's laboratory bench. For what lay before him was not just an artifact of war, it was a warning. What Runge couldn't yet grasp, what none of them could, was that this unassuming copper block held the key to a deadly riddle. One that had been bleeding Germany's Kriegsmarine dry. 40 U-boats lost every month. A maritime massacre. And now, with terrible clarity, the cause began to emerge. A radar frequency invisible to German detectors. Not strategy, not tactics, but wavelengths were deciding the fate of the Atlantic. And with that understanding came the first cracks not in walls or weapons, but in the German psyche. Now shift your imagination to that bitter February morning. Rotterdam. Dutch resistance fighters, seasoned by silence and survival, peer from their safe houses as German soldiers swarm a field, sealing off the wreckage with rare urgency. Something was different. The Stirling bomber serial number Arnaut 264 of RAF's 7th Squadron had not made it home. It was only its second combat mission when flak tore through the port wing. The crew of 7 never stood a chance. A fireball, a crater, gone. But in death, they carried something priceless for the living. Inside that doomed aircraft was Britain's latest secret weapon, the H-2S ground mapping radar, a system designed to grant Allied bombers eyes in the dark, through smoke, through clouds, through night itself. And at the very core of it, like a heart forged of innovation and copper, lay the cavity magnetron. This was not just a machine, it was a turning point. A gamble Winston Churchill himself had agonized over. Should this marvel be risked in combat so soon? Just 3 days prior, on January 30th, H-2S radar had seen its fiery debut over Hamburg. Now, in Cologne's aftermath, fate had delivered a fully intact specimen into German hands. Precisely the nightmare Churchill had feared. Within hours of the crash, a name was whispered in Berlin corridors. General der Luftnachrichtentruppe, Wolfgang Martini, the head of the Luftwaffe's signals intelligence, a man whose expertise in radar technology was unmatched in all of Germany. Martini, always quick to see through fog and deception, grasped the magnitude instantly. Could this wreck answer the tormenting questions that had plagued his high command for months? He wasted no time. His most seasoned technical crews were rushed to the site. Their preliminary findings were nothing short of astonishing. At once, Martini's greatest hopes and deepest fears collided. What they found confirmed it, a paradigm shift in electronic warfare. And so, in the icy silence of a war-torn Europe, a small copper heartbeat with silent power unseen, but utterly devastating. The world had changed, and the Germans had just realized it too late. A discovery that should not exist. Deep within the shattered hull of the Stirling bomber lay a secret the German military had never dreamed of uncovering. As technicians worked their way through the twisted wreckage, their hands trembling more from disbelief than the winter cold, they uncovered devices that belonged to another realm of possibility, not just advanced unthinkable, rotating antennas, cathode ray displays, a power system so refined, so compact, it seemed to defy the known laws of engineering. These were not remnants of a prototype, nor speculative designs from a theoretical paper. This was combat-ready equipment deployed, operational, real. And then came the moment that would send a chill down the spine of every radar engineer in the Reich. The technicians removed the heart of the system, the transmitter assembly. When they examined it, slowly, carefully, reverently, they understood why their own theories had failed them. The British had succeeded where German science had declared defeat. What stared back at them was the Magnetron, model CV-64, a solid copper cylinder no larger than a bottle 8 centimeters across, 12 long. But inside that modest shell lay an astonishing architecture. 8 perfectly symmetrical cylindrical cavities machined into the copper like organ pipes surrounding a glowing central cathode. Powerful permanent magnets encased the structure. Simple in form, terrifying in consequence. Initial tests in the field painted a bleak picture. This device could generate high-powered microwaves at frequencies no German system could detect, let alone match. No known countermeasure existed. The implications were devastating. Martini acted instantly. The Magnetron was placed under heavy guard and rushed to Berlin. Every hour lost risked more lives at sea. He understood perhaps better than anyone in Germany that this single device might finally explain the invisible blade cutting down the U-boat fleet. The British had done it. They had harnessed microwave technology into a compact radar unit deployable aboard aircraft and ships. They had achieved what German science had ridiculed as fantasy, and now Germany stood defenseless before it. The Phantom War begins. But let us not be mistaken. This story did not begin with a crash in Rotterdam. No, the path to revelation began long before that, in the icy, wind-torn expanses of the North Atlantic. Throughout the closing months of 1942, an unsettling pattern began to take shape. U-boat commanders reported incidents that defied all logic. Allied aircraft were appearing without warning, striking with surgical precision in pitch darkness, in storms, in fog. They seemed to see through the night itself. One such report, filed in December 1942, came from Kapitän Leutnant Hans Joachim Schwanke, commander of U-43. His boat had been traveling through the treacherous Bay of Biscay on the surface, recharging batteries on a night as black as coal, and then out of nowhere light. Searchlights flared above him. slicing the darkness like blades. There had been no warning, no METOX alarm, no engine hum, nothing. Depth charges fell like thunderbolts, bracketing the diving submarine and inflicting brutal damage. The crew survived, but only just. Schwantke's war diary captured the nightmare. We were blind. The METOX gave no alarm. The aircraft appeared as if materialized from darkness itself. Only luck saved us. We heard the bombs falling and crash-dived with seconds to spare. Our detector should have warned us minutes in advance. Instead, we had no warning at all. Was it a new radar? Was it something else entirely? Whatever it was hunting them. The warnings were everywhere and ignored. Across occupied Europe, from the harbors of Lorient to the offices of U-Boat Command in Paris, similar reports poured in. U-boats were being ambushed at night, blindsided on the surface. The very conditions that once offered concealment, darkness, cloud, rain, had become irrelevant. The enemy saw everything. The Germans' trusted radar warning system, METOX, once a sailor's guardian angel, was now leading them into traps. Designed to detect the older ASV Mark II radar operating at 1.5-meter wavelengths, METOX had become tragically outdated. But its operators didn't know that. They trusted it. They believed it still worked. That belief was costing them dearly. The numbers don't lie. The statistics were unforgiving and getting worse by the month. November 1942, German U-boats struck hard. 119 merchant ships sunk, totaling 729,000 tons. In return, they lost 13 submarines. December, a sharp decline. Just 60 ships sunk, 330,000 tons, and 5 U-boats lost. January 1943, the descent steepened. 37 ships sunk, 7 U-boats lost. February, disaster. Only 34 merchant ships destroyed, but 17 U-boats never returned. The tide was not turning. It was crashing down. Dönitz faces the storm. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, newly promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine on January 30, 1943, still maintained direct control over the U-boat arm. And as he pored over daily combat reports, something gnawed at him. His command center tracked every submarine position, every convoy route, every attack and counterattack. But the patterns defied reason. How were Allied planes intercepting U-boats before they reached convoys at night? Why were boats bombed while crossing the Bay of Biscay in what should have been complete invisibility? How could submerged vessels be tracked and destroyed in daylight through layers of ocean and weather? There was no rational explanation, and that terrified him. The son-in-law's silent war. Working just down the corridor was Korvettenkapitän Günther Hessler, a man with more than professional stakes in the outcome. He was Dönitz's trusted staff officer, and his son-in-law, married to Dönitz's daughter Ursula since 1937. For weeks, Hessler buried himself in combat logs, radar charts, after-action reports. He was hunting ghosts, trying to find the flaw, the pattern, the answer that would explain the mysterious hemorrhaging of U-boats. But what do you do when your enemy sees what you cannot? When their eyes are not in their heads, but in the air-emitting beams that pass through clouds, darkness, even water? You begin to realize the battlefield has changed, and you're fighting a war you can no longer understand. The evidence was undeniable, but the implications were maddening. A pattern had clearly emerged, one impossible to ignore, yet just as impossible to explain. Allied forces had acquired a detection capability far beyond anything the Germans had anticipated. It hadn't come gradually through improved tactics or sharper training. No, this leap had occurred rapidly between the end of 1942 and the first weeks of 1943. Something new was at play, something terrifying. But what sort of device could pierce fog, cloud banks, and pitch-black night? What kind of technology could pick out the thin silhouette of a submarine's conning tower from vast distances, or follow the whisper of a snorkel's exhaust trail when even the sharpest human eyes saw only darkness? The questions kept multiplying, each more unnerving than the last. In desperation, Dönitz summoned Germany's top minds, physicists, engineers, radar technicians, to emergency strategy sessions in January and February 1943. Yet rather than answers, what he uncovered was ignorance wrapped in arrogance, a chilling combination. The consensus among the Reich's radar authorities was firm. No radar system, they insisted, could function effectively at wavelengths shorter than 50 centimeters. It was simply a matter of physics. At such high frequencies, the limitations of vacuum tube technology rendered any attempt to generate adequate power impossible, so said the experts. Therefore, the enemy's detection improvements had to lie elsewhere. The METOX detectors, designed to sniff out radar emissions from aircraft operating at 1.5-meter wavelengths, should have sufficed. These devices had worked well in the past, offering precious minutes of warning that allowed U-boats to dive before Allied planes could attack. If they no longer functioned, something fundamental had changed. But what? Speculation blossomed into desperate theories. Some proposed the Allies had developed infrared detection systems machines that could track the faint heat signature of diesel exhaust. Others suggested acoustic sensors, despite the implausibility of such systems functioning at the distances involved. Very few dared to mention centimetric radar. Yes, it was theoretically possible. Yes, it had been explored, but it had also been dismissed. German research into centimetric radar, built around experimental magnetron designs, had concluded years earlier that such systems held no military value. The engineering challenges were deemed insurmountable, too costly, too complex, and if German science-respected, methodical superior had declared it unworkable, then how could the British, suffering under constant bombardment and industrial collapse, have possibly succeeded? This certainty that German science was unassailable would not survive what happened next. The captured British magnetron from the Rotterdam crash arrived in Berlin on February 5, 1943, alongside photographs and intelligence summaries of the full H-2S radar installation. With a growing sense of unease, Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Runge convened an elite circle of Germany's microwave experts. This would become known as the Rotterdam Working Group, or in formal terms, Arbeitsgemeinschaft Rotterdam. Their mission was urgent and singular: to dissect the device, understand its workings, and, most importantly, determine what it meant for the war at sea. The group's first formal meeting occurred on February 22nd or 23rd at Telefunken's Berlin offices, but the investigation had already begun days earlier. On February 6th, the team connected the magnetron to a laboratory power supply. What they discovered sent shock waves through the room. The device's inner workings quickly revealed themselves: 8 precisely machined cavities in the copper body, arranged like petals around a central cathode. These cavities served as resonant chambers. When energized, they manipulated electrons spiraling through the field of the permanent magnets, generating electromagnetic oscillations with staggering efficiency. Dr. Otto Hackenberg, a young physicist assigned to document the examination, would recall that moment with vivid clarity in post-war interviews. when we first energized the magnetron using laboratory power supplies. The frequency counter registered 3.3 gigahertz, a frequency we could barely measure, let alone generate with any power. The output meter showed 40 kilowatts of peak power. To the German team, it was as if they had stepped into a future they were never meant to see. What they had dismissed as impossible was not only possible, it was operational, airborne, and already rewriting the rules of naval warfare. It was as if, having prepared for a duel with rifles, one suddenly faced artillery. That's how the realization struck the scientists huddled around the humming, copper-bodied heart of the British device. The curtain had lifted. The mystery was no longer a mystery, it was a catastrophe. In that moment, the futility of the METOX system became crystal clear. Designed to detect radar emissions in the meter band around 1.5 meters in wavelength or 200 megahertz, it was utterly blind to what the British were now using. This captured device operated at a wavelength of 9.1 centimeters, over 16 times shorter, and far, far outside the range of any German radar warning receiver. It was as if Allied aircraft were whispering across an entirely different dimension of the electromagnetic spectrum. The Germans couldn't hear it, couldn't even guess it existed, and the British, they could see everything. Runge's team, galvanized by both scientific fascination and rising dread, labored without pause for 2 full weeks. Piece by piece, they reverse-engineered the entire H-2S radar system from the wreckage and scattered parts of the downed bomber. What they uncovered would shake the foundation of German radar strategy. At the core was the magnetron. It powered a rotating antenna, sweeping a full 360 degrees beneath the aircraft. Signals bounced back from the Earth's surface were processed and visualized on a planned position indicator display, a cathode ray tube that painted a ghostly, glowing map of coastlines, rivers, cities, and terrain. Even through solid cloud, even in moonless blackness, crews could now see. This, then, was the revolution. British bombers, guided by this system, could now navigate and strike in total darkness, in any weather, regardless of cloud cover. The H-2S radar had been designed as a tool for Pathfinder squadrons to lead mass bomber formations to their targets with ruthless accuracy. But the implications for the naval war were even more profound. Adapt the same cavity magnetron into air-to-surface radar. The ASV Mark III and Allied aircraft could now detect submarines from 20 miles away in rain, fog, or pitch night. The conning tower, once invisible except to the naked eye, now glowed like a beacon. The U-boat's small radar signature, once their best defense, meant nothing against this high-frequency radar. Worse still, there was no way to know it was there. No alarm, no detection, just sudden light from above and the descending howl of death. Every German radar warning system, from the METOX to more advanced detectors, operated within the meter band. METOX, in particular, had saved countless submarines from ASV Mark II radar, which broadcast at 1.3 to 2.6 meters wavelength. But this new system operated at 9.1 centimeters. That was 17 times higher in frequency, and the Germans had no equipment capable of even detecting it. U-boat crews were sailing directly into the jaws of the enemy, guided only by trust in instruments that were now worse than useless. By February 23, 1943, the findings of the Rotterdam Working Group were ready. The gravity of the situation demanded the attention of Germany's highest authorities. Though no surviving document confirms the presence of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring or Admiral Dönitz at the meeting, both were certainly briefed urgently and in detail. The conference room at Telefunken headquarters filled with representatives from every major German electronics firm: Siemens, AEG, Lorenz, and, of course, Telefunken itself. Senior Luftwaffe signals officers sat beside Kriegsmarine technical experts. The atmosphere was leaden. Every man in that room knew he was about to hear something historic and disastrous. Runge opened with stark honesty. His words were transcribed into the minutes, later discovered by Allied intelligence after the war. We must report with complete frankness that the British have achieved a technological breakthrough of extraordinary significance. The cavity magnetron represents an advance in microwave generation that exceeds German capabilities by at least 3 years of normal development. More critically, for current operations, the device enables radar detection systems against which we have no countermeasures and no defenses. Then came the technical breakdown: a copper block, precision-engineered with 8 resonant cavities. Frequency: 3.3 gigahertz or 9.1 thermometer wavelength, 40 kilowatts of peak power, small enough for aircraft, durable enough for combat, manufactured with consistent quality, not a prototype, but a product of mass production. The conclusions were chilling. If the British were already deploying this technology, and they clearly were then, it was only a matter of time before every Allied bomber, fighter, and ship bore radar eyes invisible to German defenses. The METOX receivers were dead weight. German night fighters, anti-aircraft gunners, surface ships, and submarines were all using radar rooted in meter band designs. They were a generation behind. When Göring received the briefing, perhaps during a demonstration of the captured H-2S system at the Humboldt-Hain Flak Tower in Berlin, his reaction was, by several accounts, one of visible consternation. The Reich's supposed mastery of science and industry had been overtaken, and they had never seen it coming. The Reichsmarshal, once triumphant in his proclamations that German skies would remain forever untouched by enemy bombs, now found himself cornered by brutal reality. His 1939 boast, "No enemy aircraft will ever reach German soil," had become a bitter irony. British bombers were not just reaching Germany, they were navigating with precision and unleashing destruction regardless of weather or visibility, guided by a technology that German science could neither match nor defend against. But if Göring reeled at the symbolic collapse of air superiority, it was Dönitz who grasped the full depth of the disaster. Through his staff channels, the admiral received the findings of the Rotterdam Working Group and quickly understood what others could only begin to process. The U-boat campaign, the cornerstone of Germany's naval strategy, was on the verge of collapse. In the first 2 months of 1943 alone, 24 submarines had been confirmed, lost 7 in January, 17 in February, with more from December, bringing the total losses over 3 months to 39. This wasn't just troubling. It was terminal. At the current pace, the U-boot Waffe would bleed out within a matter of months. No amount of tactical brilliance could compensate for losses on this scale, not when your adversary saw you before you could see them. Kapitän zur See Eberhard Gott-Soze, Dönitz's chief of operations and soon to be promoted to Konteradmiral in March 1943, tracked every grim statistic. His charts revealed the uncomfortable truth. U-boats were being lost faster than shipyards could replace them, despite output holding at 20 to 24 boats per month. Even worse, the death toll wasn't limited to hulls and steel. It was the seasoned cruise men who had survived tour after tour, who knew the Atlantic like a second skin that Germany could not replace. Training schools couldn't keep up. experience, once Germany's deadliest weapon beneath the waves, was vanishing into the deep. The Rotterdam Working Group, aware of the stakes, laid out their conclusions in a series of classified technical reports later seized by Allied intelligence at war's end. The findings painted a picture even darker than anticipated. First, Germany could not mass-produce the cavity magnetron in any meaningful quantity before 1944 at the earliest. Precision engineering of the resonant cavities required specialized copper alloys, and the powerful permanent magnets demanded cobalt, which Germany lacked. Even under emergency conditions, retooling factories, sourcing rare materials, and training machinists would take months. And months were a luxury Germany no longer had. Second, countermeasures could be developed, but not quickly. A new generation of radar detectors, capable of sensing centimetric frequencies, would take at least 6 months to design and test, and longer still to produce and install fleet-wide. Detecting 3.3 GHz emissions was a formidable challenge for a nation with minimal experience in microwave electronics. Third, and most ominous, the British had almost certainly moved beyond the technology now under German examination. The recovered magnetron operated at 9.1 centimeters, but there was no reason to believe British research had stopped there. Allied scientists could already be deploying systems at 3 centimeters, rendering any future German countermeasure obsolete before it was even operational. This was no longer a tactical setback. It was a strategic dead end. The Allies weren't just ahead, they had broken into another league of warfare. The industrial momentum behind their innovation made catching up impossible within the war's remaining time frame. Dönitz listened and understood. His headquarters, now relocated to Paris in March 1942, after the daring British Saint-Nazaire raid, exposed the vulnerability of their former base in Lorient, tracked every mission with relentless precision. Huge wall maps plotted submarine positions, convoy routes, contact points. Each red pin marked a U-boat deployment, each blue pin an Allied convoy, and increasingly, black pins marks of death clustered ominously across the Bay of Biscay, where air patrols hunted the wolf packs during their vulnerable transit to the Atlantic. The shift was visual, undeniable. There were fewer red pins, more black ones, and the convoys, those blue ribbons of Allied supply, were now flowing through the ocean with eerie ease, unmolested in waters that once belonged to the hunters. Dönitz stood before his senior staff, eyes scanning the maps, his voice heavy. "We have been fighting blind," he said. "Every advantage we believed we possessed has been neutralized by Allied technology we did not know existed. Surprise attack at night meant nothing when the enemy could see in complete darkness. The vast expanse of the Atlantic provided no concealment when radar could detect a conning tower from 20 miles away. The war beneath the waves had changed. The predator had become the prey. Our radar warning systems had lulled us into a deadly illusion, offering a false sense of security while doing nothing to protect us from the invisible threat now hunting us from the skies. That illusion had cost Germany dearly, and now Dönitz faced a brutal, inescapable question. What could be done while German industry rushed to develop countermeasures that might not arrive until sometime in 1944? There was no time for wishful thinking. Günther Hessler, Dönitz's trusted operations officer and son-in-law, put forward a series of immediate tactical adjustments. The first was radical in its honesty. All U-boat commanders were to be informed that radar warning systems were no longer reliable. The METOX, the old Guardian, could no longer be trusted. Submariners had to know they were effectively blind. U-boats would now be ordered to remain submerged as much as possible, surfacing only when absolutely necessary to recharge batteries or to make high-speed dashes. The change drastically reduced operational flexibility, but was unavoidable. Defensive anti-aircraft weaponry would also be increased across the fleet, though everyone understood this was more desperation than solution. When aircraft could detect a submarine from 20 miles out, long before the boat's lookouts even glimpsed a silhouette in the sky, heavier flak guns offered only a sliver of hope, and most urgently, Dönitz and his staff began to consider what had once been unthinkable. The Atlantic campaign might no longer be viable. If the losses continued at their current pace, and all signs pointed that way, then the tonnage war, the battle to strangle Britain's lifeline of supplies, would be lost. Allied shipyards were not just replacing ships faster than U-boats could sink them. They were outproducing Germany into irrelevance. Then came March 1943, a month that would mark both the zenith and the beginning of the end for the U-boat fleet. It was a final, massive push. Giant wolf packs of 30 to 40 submarines were hurled at convoys in a bid to overwhelm Allied defenses through sheer numerical force. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the old tactics still had teeth. Two convoys, HX-229 and SC-WWII, sailed in tandem through the North Atlantic in mid-March. They were met by a wall of steel and torpedoes. Roughly 40 U-boats from three separate wolf packs converging between March 16th and 20th. The sea boiled with battle. By the end, 21 merchant ships had been sunk, 141,000 tons, the highest single convoy loss of the war. In London, the British Admiralty acknowledged that Germany had come perilously close to severing Britain's supply line. But the cost was staggering. U-384 was confirmed lost, and many other boats returned damaged. More troubling were the month's cumulative figures. Depending on how damage and disappearance were classified, 12 to 15 U-boats were lost in March alone, many outside of the major convoy battles. Even with tactical success in terms of ships sunk, the strategic tide was shifting fast. Why? Because even the most successful attacks could no longer shift the equation. While U-boats were sinking thousands of tons, Allied shipyards, especially in America, were flooding the oceans with replacements. The Liberty Ship program, a marvel of wartime industrial engineering, had slashed average production time from over 200 days in 1941 to just 42 days by 1944. Some, like the SS Robert E. Peary, had been completed in just over 4 days. Propaganda milestones, yes, but a reflection of real capacity. At full stride, U.S. shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships every 2 days, or about 1.5 ships per day. Meanwhile, a German U-boat might sink 3,000 to 5,000 tons before being destroyed. The arithmetic was merciless. Unless Germany could destroy more than could be replaced, and do so without losing irreplaceable submarines in the process, the tonnage war would not just be lost, it had never been winnable to begin with. Then came May 1943, a month that U-boat crews would come to remember as Schwarzer Mai Black May. The Allied technological advantage, led by centimetric ASV Mark III radar and Type 271 radar aboard escort ships, began to manifest with brutal clarity. Aircraft and surface escorts worked in perfect coordination, hunting U-boats across vast distances with cold, clinical precision. The turning point came during the battle for Convoy ONS-5, stretching from late April into early May. This slow convoy of 43 merchant ships, guarded by 16 escorts, came under attack by 30 U-boats. The German submarines succeeded in sinking 12 to 13 merchant ships, but in return they lost 6 to 7 boats, with another 5 to 7 damaged so severely that they required weeks or months of repair. For the first time in the war, the U-boat exchange ratio in a major battle was approaching parity, and in the cold logic of attrition, parity was defeat. Just 2 weeks later, Convoy SC-130 dealt the final blow. Of 37 or 38 merchant vessels, none were lost, despite an assault by 25 to 33 U-boats drawn from multiple patrol lines. The implications were unmistakable. The Allies had seized total control of the battlefield. The hunters were now the hunted, and they were dying faster than they could kill. The final blow came hard and fast. Between 3 and 5 U-boats were lost in the attacks on Convoy SC-130, including the U-9 fighter-hour. With that battle, the Allies had effectively repelled the last convoy that posed a serious risk in 1943. But the storm had only begun. May became a month of reckoning for the U-boat force, its losses mounting with a relentlessness that no strategy could withstand. On May 4th, U-209 vanished. Beneath the waves of the North Atlantic, all 46 crew were lost. On May 5th, 2 more boats were destroyed, U-447 and U-663. May 6th brought the sinking of U-465 and U-563. On May 11th, the Atlantic took U-89, U-186, and U-456. The following day, May 12th, U-528 was depth-charged. No survivors. May 15th saw the destruction of U-176, and on May 19th came the loss that would strike deepest into the heart of the U-boat command, U-954. The Type 7C submarine, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Odo Loewe, was operating in the North Atlantic as part of the offensive against Convoy SC-130. But among the 47 men on board was one who made the tragedy personal for Admiral Dönitz. Lieutenant zur See Peter Dönitz, the Admiral's youngest son, served aboard U-905 as a watch officer. On May 19th, the boat was detected and engaged by 2 British escort vessels, the River-class frigate HMS Jed and the Banff-class sloop HMS Sennen. What followed was a grim demonstration of how far Allied anti-submarine tactics had evolved. The British employed the Hedgehog, a weapon that had transformed underwater warfare. Unlike conventional depth charges, which exploded at preset depths whether they hit or not, the Hedgehog fired a volley of contact-detonated projectiles. If there was an explosion, it meant one thing: a confirmed hit. There was an explosion. U-954 was obliterated. All hands lost. Final coordinates: 54 degrees and 34.19 degrees la. The message that reached Dönitz was chilling in its brevity. U-954 attacked and sunk by British escorts HMS Jed and Sennen. Hedgehog weapons achieved direct hit. No survivors. Your son is gone. But there was no pause, no retreat into mourning. Not yet. Dönitz did not step away from command. He did not take leave. There would be time for grief if Germany survived. For now, his duty remained with the 40,000 submariners still under his command. The loss of his son was a personal devastation, but it could not be permitted to interfere with what had become a strategic catastrophe. By May 20, 1943, the tally was beyond grim. The U-boat force had lost between 41 and 43 submarines in the span of a single month. The site, uboat.net, records 42 boats lost, with 10,000 out of 65 men killed and only 137 survivors. Whether the count stood at 41, 42, or 43, depending on methodology, the truth was the same. Roughly 25% of Germany's operational U-boat fleet had been annihilated. It was the bloodiest month in the history of the Unterseebootswaffe. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz convened an emergency session with his operations staff. The wall-sized plot board in the command center showed a battlefield in free fall. Red markers representing U-boat positions had been replaced with black marker symbols of death across the Bay of Biscay, the North Atlantic, and every major approach corridor. The numbers were impossible to argue with. A quarter of the force gone in 3 weeks. Casualty rates beyond anything experienced since the war began. Veteran commanders dying faster than new ones could be trained. New boats, often lost on their first patrols, sent into combat before their crews had learned even basic survival. The youngest officers, the men who were supposed to command the fleet into 1944 and beyond, were dying at 23, 24 years old, their futures swallowed by the sea before they had a chance to shape them. That same day, May 24th, Dönitz made the most agonizing decision of his career. He drafted and issued the order that marked the end of the Battle of the Atlantic as a winnable campaign. To all U-boats at sea, due to superiority of enemy location equipment and overwhelming air coverage, North Atlantic operations are temporarily suspended, effective immediately. All boats currently in the North Atlantic are to withdraw to positions southwest of the Azores. Boats transiting to operational areas are to proceed to Biscay ports. Further operations will await development of improved detection equipment and enhanced anti-aircraft capabilities. We have not surrendered. We have recognized reality. It was the first time Dönitz had acknowledged defeat, not politically, not publicly, but operationally, undeniably. He had not surrendered. He had faced the truth, and the immediate impact was dramatic. By June 1943, the transformation was complete. Only 17 merchant ships were lost in the Atlantic that month. In July, the number dropped to 9. Just 4 months earlier, in March, it had seemed that Britain's lifeline, its Atlantic supply corridor, was on the brink of being severed by German U-boats. Now, the convoy lanes ran wide and open, guarded by radar, sonar, and aircraft that saw beneath waves and through clouds. The specter that had haunted Allied shipping for years, the prowling wolf packs, was fading into irrelevance. This technological dominance would soon enable the assembly of the vast armadas required for D-Day and, ultimately, the liberation of Europe. The Allied victory in the Atlantic was not just won by bravery or numbers, but by a few centimeters of copper, pulsing with microwave energy that had rendered Germany's most fearsome weapon obsolete. And yet, even as the campaign lost meaning, the dying did not stop. Of the 40,000 men who served aboard U-boats during the war, approximately 30,000 would never return. A 75% casualty rate, the highest of any service on either side of the conflict. They drowned in flooded compartments, steel coffins crushed by the relentless pressure of depth-charged shock waves. They suffocated when oxygen ran out under prolonged attacks. They burned alive when diesel fuel ignited after a near miss. They froze to death in the North Atlantic or baked in tropical heat when forced to remain submerged for days. They fought on not because they believed in victory, but because duty demanded it, because surrender meant freeing up Allied naval and air power to crush other fronts, because they had no other option. Allied interrogation reports from the summer and autumn of 1943 painted a haunting picture of what had happened to the German submarine force, not just militarily, but psychologically. Prisoners of war, many of them once fanatically loyal, now spoke with quiet resignation, even despair. Allied intelligence officers were at first baffled by the shift. These men had not broken in combat. They had been erased by technology. They were not defeated by firepower or tactics, but by the slow, inescapable suffocation of obsolescence. They could no longer fight a war where they could neither see nor hide, a war in which every new sortie might end before a single torpedo was fired. One of the most revealing testimonies came from Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke, commander of U-515, who had sunk several merchant ships and received the Knight's Cross. His boat was eventually sunk on April 9, 1944, by the U.S. Navy Task Group 22.3, which included the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal and its destroyer escorts. Henke and approximately 40 crew members were captured. He was taken to Fort Hunt, Virginia, known only as P.O. Box 1142, where he was interrogated over a period of 6 weeks, from May 3rd to June 15th, 1944. His words would remain classified until 1985, sealed away in government archives for decades. In those transcripts, Henke offered a stark summary of what the U-boat war had become. We knew by mid-1943 that the war was lost, not because German sailors lacked courage, but because Allied technology had destroyed every advantage we once possessed. The Meathox detector became useless. We called it the grave bell. When it failed to warn of an approaching aircraft, it only rang for our funerals. He described the Naxos radar detector, introduced in September 1943, which could, in theory, detect centimetric radar. But even this came too late, and when it worked, it offered only brief warning. While Allied aircraft could detect U-boats from beyond the visual horizon. We could dive, Henke said, but the aircraft would simply circle, calling destroyers to depth charges. We could not escape what we could not see until it was too late. The emotional weight of Henke's testimony grew heavier when the subject turned to the SS Ceramic, a British liner sunk by U-515 in December 1942. During the interrogation, he was falsely accused of war crimes connected to the attack. Threatened with extradition to Britain, Henke, already demoralized, became increasingly desperate. On June 15, 1944, he attempted to escape the facility by climbing the perimeter fence. He was shot dead by guards, the only German prisoner ever to attempt escape from Fort Hunt during the war. Yet not all voices from the U-boat force ended in tragedy. Oberleutnant zur See Herbert Werner Hu served aboard 5 U-boats, surviving the sinking of U-612 in August 1942 and U-415 in July 1944, lived to tell his story. His post-war memoir, Iron Coffins, published in 1969, became one of the most widely read and respected first-hand accounts of the U-boat war from a German perspective. In it, Werner laid bare the psychological toll of fighting a war against an enemy whose technology had outpaced their courage. His words carried the weight of the thousands who never returned. We no longer feared the enemy. We feared the sea, the silence, the sonar, the ping. We were not soldiers anymore. We were ghosts inside iron coffins, waiting to be buried. Every U-boat patrol after May 1943 ceased to resemble warfare in the traditional sense. It had become, in essence, an exercise in survival. Crews were dispatched into the vast Atlantic not to dominate it, as they once had, but to outlast it, to escape detection long enough to breathe, to recharge, to return alive. By then, we understood all too well the Allies could now detect everything. The faint wake of a periscope, the whisper of snorkel exhaust. Even a partially submerged conning tower could betray our position. The ocean that once served as our greatest shield had turned against us. It became a vast, treacherous plane revealing us to our enemies while concealing them behind fog, horizon, and radar screens. We were hunted not by men, but by the ghostly reach of technology. Forced to remain submerged for days at a time, boats endured foul, recycled air. Battery levels dropped to dangerous lows. Fuel and oxygen dictated our movements, not mission objectives. Surfacing became a decision balanced between the need to survive and the certainty of exposure. The U-boat crews of 1943 were not predators. They were prey, hiding beneath the waves, while aircraft circled above with radar eyes we could not evade. One of the few senior U-boat commanders to survive the war, Korvettenkaptein Peter Erich Krimmer, bore witness to this transformation. Having commanded the U-333 through multiple patrols, he lived to publish his memoir U-Boat Commander, a periscope view of the Battle of the Atlantic, in 1984. His recollections speak to the despair of that technological imbalance. He described one mission in June 1943, shortly after the German withdrawal from the North Atlantic. We were sent to patrol off the African coast, away from the thick air coverage of the Central Atlantic. But even there, Allied aircraft found us with unnatural frequency. One afternoon, we picked up an aircraft with our new Wannsee radar detector. I ordered a crash dive 150 meters. Silent running. We stayed down for 6 hours, far longer than was safe. When we finally surfaced to snorkel, the same aircraft or another appeared again. Down we went. This continued for 14 hours. By then, our batteries were nearly dead. We had to surface or suffocate. When we broke the surface, the aircraft was waiting, positioned for a perfect attack. Only a frantic burst of flak and a dive that nearly crushed our pressure hull saved us. We never fired a torpedo that patrol. For 3 weeks we evaded, endured. We were no longer hunters. We were hunted. Back in Germany, technical investigations continued desperate attempts to bridge the growing gap. By May 1943, German engineers had produced a copy of the British cavity magnetron, the LMS-10. It was a near clone of the British CV-64, and at least 4 units were built. But even copying the technology proved a monumental task. Material shortages strangled production, especially the cobalt needed for permanent magnets. Most early magnetrons had to be assembled using magnets salvaged from captured British aircraft, an absurdly unsustainable method. Germany had no reserves, no supply chain, no way to scale. Telefunken worked on an indigenous version, the LMS-12, an effort to adapt the magnetron design using materials available within the Reich. But it would not reach even limited production until April 1944, a full year too late to influence the course of the war. By the time the program sputtered into life, the Battle of the Atlantic had already been lost. Across all variants, the total number of German-produced cavity magnetrons by war's end numbered in the hundreds fewer than 1,000 units. In stark contrast, the Allies had manufactured tens of thousands. Their industrial machine, particularly in the United States, dwarfed anything Germany could muster. The numbers alone told the story of the war. It was not just fought with guns, but with factories. In parallel, German efforts to develop radar warning receivers for centimetric radar also limped forward. The most promising result was the Naxos system, the Fuji 350 Naxos Z for aircraft, and FU-MB-7 Naxos U for submarines. Introduced in September 1943, it offered a glimmer of hope, capable, at least theoretically, of detecting Allied ASV Mark III radar operating at 9.1 cm, but again, too late. By the time Naxos reached operational units, Allied scientists had already deployed 3-centimeter radar systems, such as the H-2X, used by American forces, and advanced variants of the British H-2S. These new radars rendered Naxos obsolete before it ever left the factory floor. The Germans were caught in a perpetual Loop 1 technological generation behind, always reacting, never anticipating. Each countermeasure was designed for a threat already replaced. Each radar warning receiver failed against the next advancement. It was a race Germany was no longer running. It was chasing shadows. Even strange anomalies like the widely misreported landing of a Junkers Ju-88 night fighter equipped with Naxos at an RAF airfield highlighted the confusion of this period. The event did occur, though not in November 1943, as often claimed. But even incidents like that were too little, too late to stem the tide of defeat. The outcome had already been written in wavelengths Germany couldn't detect. On July 13, 1944, a German Ju-88G1 night fighter mistakenly landed at RAF Woodbridge. Disoriented, its crew believed they were approaching a German airfield, but their navigational error became a windfall for British technical intelligence. On board were some of the Luftwaffe's most advanced electronic systems. The FUG-350 Naxos Z radar detector, Flensburg homing equipment, and the Liechtenstein SN-2 radar. The captured aircraft was a technological goldmine. British specialists swarmed the Ju-88, dissecting every instrument. What they found was both impressive and telling. The Naxos system functioned exactly as intended. It could detect Allied radar emissions, giving Luftwaffe crews warning of incoming threats. But that was its limit. The system was purely defensive. It gave no offensive advantage, no ability to strike back, no means to locate or pursue a target. Worse still, it was already obsolete. Naxos could only detect 9.1 Tautoeter emissions, the first-generation centimetric radar signals used in ASV Mark III systems. But the Allies had already moved on. New 3-semi radar systems, such as the American H-2X and upgraded H-2S, were entering widespread use. To Naxos, they were invisible. Germany's radar warning systems had become yesterday's answers to tomorrow's problems. The Kriegsmarine, meanwhile, sought tactical responses to a strategic crisis. One such experiment was the flak U-boat, a desperate attempt to turn submarines into floating gun platforms. Certain U-boats were fitted with quad 20mm cannons and heavy anti-aircraft weaponry, the idea being that if they could no longer hide, they would stand and fight. The results were disastrous. Allied aircraft equipped with radar that saw through cloud, fog, and night could detect U-boats long before those boats detected them. Planes approached unseen, often from above or out of the sun. By the time a submarine crew raced to man the guns, the attack had already begun. The speed of the aircraft, combined with their tactical initiative, made every engagement a one-sided affair. Worse still, any radio distress call from an aircraft under fire summoned reinforcements. Surface ships, other aircraft, even escort carriers. Stationary U-boats were easily overwhelmed. The flak boat program achieved virtually nothing. More submarines were lost than aircraft shot down. It was another attempt to answer superior technology with bravery and desperation, and it failed. In a more promising move, Germany introduced the G-70's acoustic homing torpedo nicknamed Zaunkönig, T5, or Zaunkönig. These torpedoes, first delivered in August 1943, could home in on the propeller noise of escort ships. The idea was to sink the hunter before attacking the herd. And early signs were encouraging. Several escort vessels were damaged or destroyed. But the Allies adapted quickly. Within weeks, they developed the Foxer noisemaker, a towed acoustic decoy that mimicked propeller sounds and diverted torpedoes away from actual targets. The G-70s was clever, but it didn't solve the deeper problem. German U-boats still couldn't reach the convoys undetected. A torpedo that couldn't get close was as useless as one that missed. Then came the Schnorkel. Originally a Dutch invention from 1938, captured when Germany invaded the Netherlands in 1940, the Schnorkel had been largely ignored until it became a necessity. It allowed U-boats to run diesel engines while submerged, operating at periscope depth, recharging batteries without surfacing. Operational deployment began in early 1944. By mid-year, half of the U-boats sailing from French bases were Schnorkel-equipped. It improved survival, but only marginally. The system was flawed. Its wake was visible to radar, especially in calm seas. Speed was limited. Rough seas triggered the automatic air valve, choking the boat's air supply and creating sudden, painful pressure drops. Inside the boats, the atmosphere became foul, the pressure unstable, and morale grim. The Schnorkel helped evade but not attack. It preserved boats. It did not win battles. By 1944, Germany could no longer affect Allied logistics in any meaningful way. The Battle of the Atlantic had already been lost. But not all hope had been abandoned. Germany's final and most ambitious attempt to reverse the tide came in the form of the Type 21 Electro boot. It was revolutionary, a sleek, streamlined hull, triple battery capacity, a submerged speed of 17.2 knots, more than double the speed of existing U-boats. 6 forward torpedo tubes, a hydraulic reloading system capable of firing 18 torpedoes in under 20 minutes. It boasted advanced sonar, extended underwater endurance, and the ability to outrun many surface escorts while submerged. It was, in many ways, the first true submarine, rather than a surface ship that could submerge. Had the Type 21 entered service in 1943, it might have forced the Allies to pause and rethink. Instead, it arrived in 1945, too late to matter. Production was rushed. Quality suffered. Of 118 Type 21 boats constructed, only 4 were combat-ready before the war ended. Just 2 conducted patrols both in April and May 1945. Neither sank a single ship. Still, one final patrol offered a glimpse of what might have been. On April 30th, 1945, U-2511, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Adelbert Schnee, set out. Schnee was no rookie. He was one of the most experienced and successful U-boat commanders in the Kriegsmarine, and this boat, the first operational Type 21, showcased all the features German engineers had dreamed of. Its performance during that final voyage would prove both the promise and the futility of Germany's last stand beneath the waves. On May 4, 1945, deep in the Atlantic, U-2511 detected a British cruiser task force. Despite full Allied radar coverage, the German submarine closed into perfect firing position undetected. The boat's revolutionary capabilities, its silent running, its unmatched submerged speed allowed it to do what few U-boats could still achieve by that stage of the war: stalk its prey without being seen. Korvettenkapitän Adelbert Schnee, one of Germany's most accomplished U-boat commanders, had every advantage in that moment. The target was in range, the conditions ideal, the enemy unaware, and he chose not to fire. Germany had already begun surrender negotiations. The war, for all its fire and blood, was ending not with a last stand, but with a reckoning. Schnee surfaced and radioed his position on May 5, 1945. not in defiance, but in quiet acknowledgment that the long campaign beneath the waves was over. In his post-war memoir, Schnee wrote with bitter clarity, "We proved that day what the type de Pontefract could have achieved had it entered service a year earlier. But such demonstrations were meaningless. The Allies had already won not through courage alone, but through industrial capacity and technological innovation deployed in 1942 and 1943. Our most advanced technology arrived when the war was already lost. The final statistical ledger of the Battle of the Atlantic bears out Schnee's reflection and the brutal truth it contains. Between January and May 1943, as the ASV Mark III centimetric radar was being deployed but not yet widespread, German U-boats sank 245 merchant ships, totaling approximately 1,189,000 tons. In return, they lost 95 U-boats, including the catastrophic 41-43 boats lost in May alone. From June 1943 through May 1944, after centimetric radar had been fully deployed across most Allied aircraft and naval units, merchant ship losses dropped to 185 ships, totaling only 819,000 tons, despite more U-boats being at sea than ever before. And German losses? 237 U-boats. The exchange rate had not merely narrowed, it had inverted. In March 1943, at the height of U-boat effectiveness, Germany had sunk 82 merchant ships totaling 476,000 tons in the Atlantic. But just a few months later, that monthly figure plummeted to fewer than 20 ships sunk, while double-digit U-boat losses became the grim new normal. The tonnage war, the campaign to cut Britain's lifeline, had become unwinnable. In hindsight, the May 1943 convoy battles marked the final opportunity for strategic success at sea. By the time Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Runge examined the British cavity magnetron recovered from the wreckage near Rotterdam, the tide of the war had already turned. That small copper device had explained everything. The sudden precision of Allied air attacks, the vanishing concealment once offered by darkness or fog, the U-boat crew's eerie sense that they were being seen before they saw anything. The cavity magnetron didn't merely tip the balance, it rewrote the physics of warfare at sea. In the wake of the Rotterdam discovery, German naval planners and engineers launched a flurry of last-ditch adaptations, radar-absorbent coatings, inflatable decoy balloons, modified schnorkel exhausts, all in hopes of blinding the Allied radar gaze. But the results were dismal. These were mechanical answers to an electromagnetic war. The materials couldn't absorb centimetric wavelengths effectively. The balloons couldn't be deployed while submerged or during storms. The exhaust modifications reduced engine efficiency and still reflected radar signals. Electromagnetic radiation doesn't care about clever tricks, and with battery technology still tied to the limitations of 1930s engineering, remaining submerged indefinitely, the only true defense remained impossible. German submarines were trapped, visible to radar from above, vulnerable from below, and increasingly irrelevant. Captured U-boat crews confirmed as much. Their interrogations, letters, and post-war memoirs provide perhaps the most striking evidence of the cavity magnetron's war-winning impact. These were not men grasping for excuses. They were technicians, officers, engineers, men who understood exactly what had happened and why. Their words are not laced with denial, but with a strange, bitter clarity. They spoke not of poor training or bad orders or cowardice, but of total technological obsolescence. They described what it felt like to fight blind, to listen for enemies who could see them from miles away, to surface knowing they were already being tracked. They spoke of the hopelessness that set in not from defeat in battle, but from the realization that the battlefield itself had changed, and they no longer belonged to it. They were no longer warriors. They were targets. When Wilhelm Runge studied the British cavity magnetron in February 1943, he wasn't just inspecting an advanced radar component. He was conducting an autopsy on an entire military strategy. That small copper cylinder precision machine, compact and devastating, explained why convoys were surviving, why U-boats were vanishing, why commanders felt blind and crews felt doomed. The cavity magnetron revealed that the Battle of the Atlantic had been fought with Germany deaf and blind to the very frequencies that the Allies had mastered, and by the time they realized it, it was already too late. But it was that revelation, cold, clinical, and undeniable, that shattered German confidence more than any bombing raid or battlefield defeat. Not an exploding torpedo, not a fallen city, but a block of copper placed on a Berlin workbench. It destroyed the myth. The moment Wilhelm Runge examined the cavity magnetron in February 1943, Germany's strategic worldview began to collapse. If the British under siege from the air, bleeding industrially, scrambling for survival, could produce something so advanced, so quietly, then what else were they hiding? What other invisible weapons might already be circling above the Atlantic or embedded inside bomber bays? That psychological rupture spread quickly through the ranks of German leadership. For years, they had built war plans around the belief in technological superiority in German engineering as an unshakable advantage. Now, that foundation cracked. Every intelligence report after Rotterdam was tinged with doubt. Analysts no longer asked if the enemy might deploy a new weapon, they assumed it. German defensive preparations grew more cautious, even paranoid. And in the process, Germany diverted precious scientific talent, material resources, and industrial output into countermeasure programs that arrived too late to matter. By autumn 1943, the Allies' centimetric radar had matured into a war-winning tool. The Type 271 naval radar, descended directly from the cavity magnetron, was now standard on convoy escorts. It could detect surfaced U-boats at ranges up to 20 kilometers and periscopes at nearly 900 yards. Operating at a 9.7 centimeter wavelength and producing 70 kilowatts of peak power, it turned the ocean's surface into a canvas, where even the faintest shadow could be seen. From the air, the ASV Mark III radar gave RAF Coastal Command the ability to patrol thousands of square kilometers day or night, cloud or clear, and spot U-boats that no longer had the sky to hide them. And the Americans? They went even further. The H-2X radar, a 3 centimeter wavelength evolution of the British H-2S, gave bomber crews the power to navigate and strike in total darkness. Weather was no longer a shield. Clouds were no longer protection. The electromagnetic spectrum had become the Allies' most powerful weapon. And all of it, every system, every platform, every sensor traced its lineage back to that copper cylinder pulled from the wreckage near Rotterdam. It was the key. The moment the Allies unlocked the cavity magnetron, they unlocked electromagnetic dominance over the entire theater of war. In contrast, German counter-efforts consumed enormous resources and delivered little in return. The Naxos radar warning receiver, for example, absorbed vast amounts of engineering effort. It worked, yes, but by the time it was deployed, it was already obsolete. U-boat production shifted toward new designs, optimized for submerged operation, slower on the surface. But this reorientation came too late. These advanced submarines were never deployed in numbers large enough to impact the outcome. Other research projects explored hydrogen peroxide propulsion, passive sonar, even underwater television systems. Extraordinary ideas, none of which reached frontline deployment before Germany collapsed. German engineering genius was not absent. It was simply reactive, always chasing the last Allied breakthrough, always one generation behind. And so the final numbers tell the rest of the story. Germany built 181 U-boats during the war. Of those, 785 were destroyed. 608 were lost to enemy action. The rest were scuttled, lost to accidents, or removed from service. Just 156 U-boats survived to surrender in May 1945. Of the 40,000 men who served aboard them, 30,000 were killed. A 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military service on either side of the war. They fought with discipline. They fought with courage, but no amount of courage could overcome a battlefield that had been rewritten by physics. The cavity magnetron, born at Birmingham University in 1939 and 40, and refined by GEC for combat use, would go on to shape the post-war world. The microwave technology it introduced formed the basis for post-war communications, television, satellite systems, and eventually even the microwave oven. But its greatest legacy, perhaps, was not technological, but strategic. The Tizard mission of 1940, when Britain shared the magnetron with the United States, established a model of Anglo-American scientific cooperation that would extend through the Cold War and into the 21st century. The lesson was clear. Deploy advanced technology early, even if there's a risk it might be captured. If your industry can produce it faster at greater scale, the enemy can't catch up before the war is over. This became a doctrine. It shaped military innovation throughout the jet age, the nuclear era, and into the information age. It taught generations of military planners that speed of deployment, not secrecy alone, was the true key to dominance. In the end, the Allies didn't just win with soldiers and ships. They won with centimeters of copper spinning inside the heart of a magnetron, casting radar shadows across the seas and rendering entire fleets visible to those who knew how to listen. And by the time Germany finally understood what had happened, the war in the Atlantic wasn't just lost. It was already history. For Germany's U-boat force, the story ended not in glory, but in surrender and scuttling. On May 4, 1945, just days after Adolf Hitler's suicide, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, briefly elevated as head of state, issued a final command. All U-boats were to cease offensive operations. 4 days later, on May 8th, the war ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally. With that surrender began Operation Deadlight. Every U-boat still afloat was ordered to surface, fly black flags, and navigate to pre-assigned Allied ports for formal surrender. But many commanders couldn't bring themselves to do it, not after what they had endured, not after what they had lost. They scuttled their boats instead, over 200 of them, sending them to the depths of the sea by their own hands. Operation Rainbow, echoing the scuttling of the German high seas fleet at Scapa Flow in 1919, became a final gesture of defiance, or perhaps of mourning. They would not surrender the steel coffins in which 3 out of every 4 of their comrades had died, because by then they knew it had never been about courage or skill or tactics. It had been about physics. They had been defeated not by destroyers, not by convoy escorts, not even by aircraft, but by a copper cylinder, no larger than a clenched fist, forged in British factories and installed in Allied planes and ships in numbers the Reich could never match. The cavity magnetron, precisely machined with 8 resonant cavities around a central cathode, had turned electromagnetic theory into decisive battlefield dominance. The February 1943 examination at Telefunken headquarters had been many things: a scientific marvel, a technical shock. But in truth, it was an autopsy. That one device had explained everything: the impossible sightings, the unrelenting air attacks, the submarines that vanished before their commanders could send a single message. Germany had been fighting blind, while the Allies had learned to see through night, fog, and ocean alike. And from that moment forward, German scientists, commanders, and leaders understood. The future had already arrived, and they were not part of it. The statistics are inescapable. Germany commissioned 181 U-boats during the war. 785 were destroyed, 648 by enemy action, the rest lost to accidents, stricken, or scuttled. Only 156 boats survived to surrender. Of the 40,000 submariners who sailed under the Iron Cross, 30,000 died. A 75% casualty rate, the highest suffered by any service on either side of the war. Their skill was undeniable, their bravery unmatched. But bravery cannot overcome electromagnetic waves. That copper core, born in Birmingham in 1939-1940 and engineered for war by GEC, was more than a component. It was a revolution, one that reshaped not just radar, but the post-war world. The microwave technology that guided bombers over Berlin would soon guide satellites, television signals, even the microwave oven humming in your kitchen. But in war, its impact was immediate and total. Without centimetric radar, Allied convoy losses in 1943 would likely have remained unsustainable, risking starvation in Britain and disrupting preparations for D-Day. Without radar-equipped aircraft, U-boats could have prowled with impunity in airspace unreachable by shore-based patrols. Without detection superiority, the Atlantic would have remained contested. Instead, the Magnetron created an electromagnetic net-one so vast, so precise, so unrelenting that even the ocean itself could no longer conceal Germany's most dangerous fleet. And in war, scale matters as much as science. British and American factories produced tens of thousands of magnetrons. German factories, starved of cobalt, copper, and time, produced hundreds. The Allied decision to deploy their best technology early, even at the risk of capture, proved decisive. As American physicist Luis Alvarez, who worked on radar at MIT's Radiation Laboratory, would later say, "The cavity magnetron won the Battle of the Atlantic, the air battle over Germany, and ultimately the war." That line, quoted often, oversimplifies, but it is not wrong. The magnetron's electromagnetic reach strangled the U-boat campaign, blinded the Luftwaffe at night, and lit up European skies for Allied bombers. Its use in strategic bombing, submarine hunting, and convoy protection tilted every front in the Allies' favor. Germany's last hope to match that power was always one step behind. And by the time German scientists had pieced together what Allied technology truly represented, it was already too late. They launched research into exotic propulsion, stealth coatings, radar decoys, ingenious, yes, but futile, because every countermeasure they conceived was aimed at yesterday's radar. And by the time they caught up, the Allies had moved on. And that is what makes the Rotterdam device more than a footnote in naval history. It is a symbol of what happens when technology meets production, when science finds scale, when the invisible becomes visible. In that copper block, Germany's admirals and physicists saw not just a new kind of radar, but the very instrument of their defeat. They saw a war that had already been lost, and they fought on not out of hope, but out of duty, because hope dies slowly and honor dies last. But in the end, they knew. The war had been decided not by steel or gunpowder, but by wavelength and frequency, by coils and cavities, by the flicker of a radar screen that could pierce fog, night, and ocean. And the men who walked out of Telefunken's laboratory in February 1943 carried that knowledge with them like a weight, heavy, final. The future had spoken, and it spoke in microwaves.